Okay. So I'm gonna kind of like I would like you to bear with me because I want to be a bit provocative, and I know that we have got the ministers and distinguished guests, and I should behave myself. Well, I'm not gonna behave myself. I'm just gonna try and provoke. So I'm hoping that we'll do a few things. Let me see. Is this working? Go to objectives. Okay. Okay. There are a few things that I would like to do today. I want to open a space for mutual provocation and engagement, and I will try to provoke you. I hope you can provoke me, and I'll be disappointed if nobody's provoked. So I really want people to be provoked. So I also want to look at some of the challenges for youth and youth work. I've only got about 20 minutes, so I'll try and not waffle and just get to the point. And I also want us to reflect on global youth work as a pedagogic tool to provoke consciousness and to take action. I mean, a lot of my specialty over the last 15, 20 years has been around global youth work. And I'm also a scholar activist. So I'm not only a decolonial scholar who's interested in youth work and its transformative power. I come at it from a very decolonial angle. But also, I also hope that I'll be able to advance this pedagogy of disruption that I want to share. I'm sure youth work has been disruptive in some spaces. I just wanted to share my thinking because I'm involved in practice. I'm involved as a researcher. I'm involved as an activist and as a teacher. So I wanted to bring all of these things together. But also in bringing these things together, I wanted to be clear about my positionality and my situatedness. Yeah? So we know some of these challenges because they're there, and most of us are dealing with these challenges on a daily basis. The demographic bulge, what 1.3 million by 2030, and then it is getting bigger. Um, and we also need to think about how youth work happens in different contexts. When I was in the Gambia, I went to be circumcised, and I went through the rite of passage. I think that is some kind of youth work I had to go through. That is very different from me being a detached youth worker or a center-based youth worker somewhere in England. So we need to understand the complexity of context, of form, of content of youth work. And I want us to understand that youth work cannot be a colonial project, imported, parachuted in. It has to respond to the situatedness of the environment and the people who are engaged with it. And we also cannot devalue the youth work of others. I mean, sometimes we are quite pedantic in terms of the curriculum of youth work or what is youth work and what isn't youth work. And I think these boundaries, we need to be able to understand them, but it also needs to be a very much decolonized concept. And I'm not only talking about one form of decoloniality, I'm talking about the many ways in spaces and classes can be colonized. So I want us to think about that as well. We also think about globalization, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. We're talking about how time and space has been conquered and how technological innovations have significantly changed human interaction. But also, whilst it is a great opportunity, it can also be seen as uh, uh, as something that affects some other people disproportionately. The digital divide, the cost of data. So all of these things are things that we should think about as well. Obviously, uh, more resources tend to be available in the urban areas than in the rural areas, and more youth workers tend to be available there as well. So these are some of the challenges as well in terms of how youth work engages with different sections of the population. Political strife. Yelena has um, given a very very powerful story of Ukraine, but I can think about a lot of other stories as well that affect people, whether it's about political tension, whether it's about the coup d'etats that happen in West Africa, or some of the things happening in India, from across the Commonwealth and across the world. There are so many political and civil strifes that are actually affecting the ability of people to live with dignity, especially young people. Obviously, the socio-economic, where sometimes 70 to 80% of the world resources are consumed and controlled by less than 20%. And we have to understand that globalization is premised on a very, very clear extractive neoliberal agenda, which is about capitalism and making money at all cost. That for me is my fact. And if we talk about all of these changes and we're not addressing the fundamental cause of these strifes, then we're just pressing an adhesive plaster on a broken bone, closing our eyes and seeing no evil and hearing no evil and hoping that everything will be sorted out. And I hope that that's something that we want to pick on as well. Obviously, the issue of, you know, mental health, pre-COVID, but post-COVID more especially, has become more significant. The Honorable Minister did talk about the gentleman who used to laugh alone on his phone, but maybe that is one form of manifestation. So it is also important that we find spaces and ways and pedagogies of engaging with young people around this. I'm sure most of you know about some of these challenges from your particular setup better than I do, but from my perspective, these are just some of them. But also the challenges of youth work specifically. I think defining youth work in itself is a very problematic thing because it's a huge space of contestation. But the lack of resources is a big issue that most of us know about, whether it's in terms of staff, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of funding. Youth work tends to be the first place to be cut and the last place to be given resources. And then we have got beautiful, beautiful people, absolutely brilliant people who work in day and night and try to make the youth situation better and to engage in youth work, a lot of time on voluntary basis without expecting any remuneration. But the fact remains that that it is severely underfunded. I think in England it's a very sad story in terms of what's happened. The total decimation of youth work is just mind-blowing. But I'm sure in other countries as well, we can also think about how youth work is greatly under-resourced and the limited funding it has had. I mean, the training that's actually missing, it's also there. We also talk about how youth work would engage with unemployment, underemployment. In some countries, there's as much as 35% of youth unemployment. And that's just staggering, given that, the huge demographic that is youth. So how do we engage with young people? Because we all know that if we do not engage with young people properly who are unemployed, then it becomes a recipe for disaster. Yeah, because those who have nothing to live for are not worried about dying for anything. Then we also can think about what learning opportunities can we generate. When Fran Fanon's, talked about the wretched of the earth, from the slums, from economically deprived areas to just seeing young people across the Sahara trying to get into Europe through the back way, to all manners of challenges that these young people face. Because when you have hope, and that's why later I'll talk about pedagogies of hope. When you have hope, you have something to wake up for. You have something to get out of bed for. You have something to live for. I mean, when young people say to me that we're going to go across the desert and we're going to cross the Mediterranean and we either get to Europe or we die, the level of hopelessness in those voices and in those and these are rational decisions that people have taken. These are rational decisions. Nothing is wrong with them. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're making a conscious choice to either die trying or to get in there. So we need to think about how we can work. Youth work must continue to think about how we can work with this issue as well. But again, one of the key things, and I'm sure John has written a lot around that, is about how we demonstrate impact and how we conduct evaluation. Youth workers traditionally are very good at doing the work. But in terms of telling their story, evaluating impact and capturing impact, that's not our strongest point, is it? And maybe we need to think about how we can do these things as well. But again, also, there is this lot of participation that we talk about that we're so proud of. But when it comes to genuine participation of young people, I think so often it's more often the case that it's not happening and it's tokenistic than it's being real and genuine. We talk about co-production, we talk about mutuality, we talk about genuine participation. And that's a challenge for youth work, because at what point do you, actually, you cannot grant consciousness to young people. Young people earn their consciousness. But if you control that process of earning consciousness, because they can become too powerful to challenge the status quo, then that becomes problematic as well. And the last thing that I want to talk about, that I want to identify, is actually just the diversity of youth work settings. We need to recognize that the northern lenses through which we view youth work and we propagate and theorize youth work as ways of knowing and ways of being, the configuration, the sanctification, the validation of these ways of knowing and being are not the exclusive ways of knowing and being. And youth work happens. I go to a lot of countries in the South, and I see powerful, beautiful youth work, which the northern imagination cannot even understand, let alone begin to engage with. So I think we need to be quite flexible in how we understand these challenges. When I was doing youth work in the Gambia, my preoccupation was about daily survival, linked to the youth work of daily bread, you know. And when I was practicing here in the UK, I'm still practicing, and in other European countries, I think we begin to see youth work not only in terms of daily bread, not only in terms of, for example, clubbing the young people and sedating them from causing trouble, but also in terms of kind of like their personal development and their social development. So we need to understand that youth work is based on context and curatedness and positionality, and we need to understand that as well. You know, Kerry Young, love her to bits, and since I encountered her, she talked about this, and that stuck in my mind. That youth work is an exercise in moral philosophy. It enables and supports young people to ask and answer. And this is the important point, the central question of self, the existential question of self. What sort of person am I? What kind of interactions do I want to have with myself and others? What kind of society do I want to live in? Because, Marian earlier talked about, and the other gentleman, yeah, he talked about, yes, sir, you talked about the previous conferences and kind of like, sorry, what's your name again, sir? Robinson, yes. So you talk about how in the past we've talked about from the concept to the purpose of youth work. And I guess I want to always come back to that, because for me, Kerry Young's questions that were asked in 1999 are still relevant in terms of the purpose of youth work, in terms of the context of youth work, in terms of the shape of youth work, in terms of the form of youth work. So if we look at what we're trying to do, and then we often as youth workers, I'm not only speaking as an academic, I'm speaking as a practitioner who spent considerable time, probably about 30 years actually in the youth work field, and have practiced youth work at different levels in different forms. Um, and I think that in my experience, in my research, youth work is something that often happens at the personal and at the cultural level, but it rarely happens at the structural level, because we are so much focused on the immediacy of the now of the young people. But as Thompson argues, there is an inextricable link between the personal, the cultural, and the structural. And if we want to dismantle the oppression, or whatever we want to call it, we need to understand the links between these three levels. If you look at the work of Althusser as well, who I keep on coming back to, Althusser talks about two things. He talks about the softcore violence of the state and the hardcore violence of the state. And the softcore violence of the state is the church, is society, is the media. Yeah, these things. And the hardcore violence of the state is the army, the police, the administration, the judiciary. So if we want to bring about change, if we want to build a more equal society, then it should not only be at the personal or at the softcore violence of the state. We must increasingly, youth work must increasingly engage with the hardcore violence of the state. They must increasingly engage with the structural. And youth work can be cut and will be cut because it's the softest target. But also it will pose least resistance compared to all other things, because youth workers and youth work doesn't always work with the hardcore. It's always at the periphery. It's always on the sidelines. And it can sometimes work within and against the system. But I am advocating that youth work must become more disruptive, must move beyond just the personal and cultural, more into the structural. And then maybe then there could be more changes happening. I'm going to now talk a little bit about globalization. If globalization is this process, where interaction between people is actually a lot closer, where time and space and distance has been conquered, where, there is almost exclusive kind of like an instantaneous interaction. But at the same time, every person, every action, and every reaction must be located within this new personal, local, national, global metrics. Okay? So that's why in this model that I developed in my book called Global Youth Work, Provoking Consciousness and Taking Action. And for me, global youth work and youth work in general is about one, provoking consciousness, because you're getting people to see the world in a way they have not seen the world before. It's basically new ways of knowing, but also how you take action as a result of this newfound consciousness, how you actually engage with new ways of being is also the fundamental purpose for youth work for me. It's about how do we, one, provoke consciousness, and two, support people to take action. Whatever action they choose is best for them or meets with their situation. So I also think that when we talk about globalization, we talk about the five phases of globalization: the economics, the politics, the culture, the environment, the technology. And whatever thing we do, whatever issue we're dealing with, can be located within these five phases. But within these five phases as well, and in constant interaction with the young person, we can think about the personal, the local, the national, and the global. Are you still with me? Have I lost you? There's no need for us to do any more clapping. Okay. Okay, good. Okay. So we need to think about how the five phases and the planks are very, very important. But again, if we look at global youth work and potentially youth work, because for me, global youth work is just taking the youth work to another dimension, which is the global level. But we can think about whether we're talking about the individual or the collective constructed reality of the young people that we work with. And we can think about, if we provoke consciousness, does that consciousness result into a critical consciousness, as in fairest balance, to think about conscientization and getting a newfound consciousness? And this is not something that you give to somebody. It's something that somebody goes through a process in order to earn, and they own it. So do you provoke critical consciousness and people then move into action at the personal, at the local, at the national, and at the global levels? Or do you actually provoke a dormant consciousness that is there, sleeping somewhere, like an inactive volcano that's going to come up one day, but it's not yet there, and it might take a series of other actions to make it happen? So for me, this is what global youth work tries to do. So global youth work for me as a pedagogic tool is engage with the process and concept of globalization. What is globalization? How are we so much more interconnected? How is the process being used by a vehicle, by the system, as either a vehicle for good and social good or one for exploitation? It's also based on young people's realities. As Bernard Davis would say in his Manifesto for Youth, metaphorically and literally. It's based on the principles of informal education. Some people talk about global citizenship education, which might be in the more formal setting. But when we talk about global youth work, for me, it is based on the informal education principles. It also fundamentally must challenge oppression and promote social justice. That is my positionality. You don't have to agree with me. And it doesn't make a difference if you agree with me or not. But that is my position, and I'm putting it out there. Yeah, because I cannot be engaged in any kind of global youth work or youth work that doesn't promote social justice, because that is my reality. And that is the basis on which I get up every day to do what I do. So it has to promote social justice, and it needs to challenge oppression. And I'm sure people have many positions before and after. When I work with young people, you know, and I work to challenge oppression in all its manifestation. I work to promote social justice. It's not about an act of indoctrination, but it's an about of mutual engagement and being very clear, being very upfront about where I'm coming from. It also kind of like is located in young people's realities, and a number of authors have said this, and there are thousands more that we cannot list here. But more importantly, what I've been thinking about, is just this pedagogy of disruption, because um, it's very sometimes youth work is used as a tool to sedate young people, to keep them out of the streets, to club them, to keep them from making trouble. And you have to understand that youth work is premised on benevolent kind of like historicities. That is about how we help the vagrant youths and how we engage them and all that kind of stuff. And I think sometimes it's easier to stop the young people from causing trouble just to engage in diversionary activities. But I'm talking about a disruptive approach which is very deliberate, which is very intentional. And last time I was approached for a job, and they saw my LinkedIn profile and said, "You're involved in pedagogies of disruption. What kind of trouble are you going to cause?" And they were very serious about this and said, "If you're going to cause any trouble, we don't want you here. Don't come here." I said, "But it's about." But pedagogies of disruption, if you see in the diagram, it involves a lot of things, because there is pedagogy of ambiguity. And pedagogy of ambiguity is actually where you have encounters, where there is uncertainty. There's an encounter in the making, and people are not clear where they stand. So pedagogies of ambiguity are actually managing those creative tensions that are engaged in our interaction. But there's also pedagogy of discomfort, and the pedagogies of discomfort about managing, because learning should be uncomfortable sometimes. It can be nice, it can be cool, it can be sweet, but sometimes it's actually very disruptive and very uncomfortable. And that's a learning process that you take people through. So managing the discomfort and not letting it spill into something else is part of, for me. And if you disrupt people, you intentionally disrupt people, it will be uncomfortable. I remember somebody who talks about this story about submitting a report in a very disruptive way. And, his line manager said to him, "Do you want me to take you on to learn how to write minutes? Because, because this is not the way we do things." But you have to understand that there'll be consequences when you actually disrupt the status quo. And then the people who are not used to that level of disruption will also be comfortable. So pedagogies of this discomfort are actually about dealing with that. But it's also pedagogies of compassion, of kindness, of caring. Not maybe more so after COVID, but during COVID, the people that you disrupt, how do you make sure that you have a very kind, compassionate approach with them? Because you don't mess them up and then throw them away. It is important that there are pedagogies of kindness, of compassion, of caring that actually are engaged with in these pedagogies of disruption. And there's, of course, pedagogy of criticality, pedagogy of hope, pedagogy of love. So for me, all of these pedagogies come together in this pedagogy of disruption, which is about addressing the dynamic needs of young people, where they are, how they're evolving. It is about not about surface learning or surface engagement. It is also about a deeper learning, transformative learning, not memorization and repetition and all that kind of stuff. Not banking, as Freda would argue, but a different kind of learning, which is transformative, which is more critical. We can also talk about questioning the logic of the system, because fundamentally, the supply lines are what keep the things the way they are, so that we reproduce inequalities. And sometimes, as youth workers, we are complicit in reproducing inequalities as instruments of the state. Honorable Excellencies, my apologies. But like I said, I'll cause trouble. But this is the fundamental observation that I have, that sometimes we who are supposed to be more critical are actually complicit in reproducing these inequalities. And we are not necessarily supporting young people to unlearn and to dissent. And I think it's really, so this pedagogy of disruption is, for me, has a big part in doing that, using a problem-based and real-life learning situation, looking at social justice and structural inequality. We talked about this. We talked about Thompson and Althusser earlier on, but you can see that the structural inequality, the IMF and World Bank conditionalities and the loans that we have got in a lot of the developing countries, we can do all kinds of development. If these things are not lifted, we will still be dancing on the same spot, running on the same spot. These are structural issues that actually keep us oppressed. And unless and until we deal with these issues, tackle it head on, we will still be in the same place. Yeah. But again, we're talking about a radical departure from the status quo. I mean, some people need to pay the mortgages, and that is more important than anything else. But in working, as Colin Prescott would say, as intellectual insurgents, working within the system and against the system, how do we balance this pedagogy of disruption? How do we manage these tensions? I think that is something that we can all reflect on. So in concluding, because I'm told that I should not keep on talking. If you have questions, I'm happy to just engage with that. I think there is an increasing recognition of the structure, that youth work must engage as it does at the micro and at the meso. But at the macro, it must increasingly put pressure. It must increasingly engage in acts of politics and acts of structural change. Because otherwise, just plaster on a broken bone. You've got 2 or 3 broken bones in your foot, and you just want to put a small, tiny plaster, like adhesive plaster, and just think that it's going to go away. I don't know who you're fooling, but not me anyway. Maybe yourself. But I'm also fooling myself anyway, because I'm part of this struggle as well. So we have to understand, and for me, acknowledge the context, the forms, the content of youth work. And we have to also think about positionality. You know, I am a scholar activist, a decolonial scholar who spent half of my time in the Gambia and the other half in the UK. And what is my story? What is my experience? That must be in the mix. And the youth worker cannot be objective and remove themselves from this. The young people cannot be removed. And that's why for some people who deal with global youth work, they talk about an issue, but they cannot make the personal, local, national, and global connection between the young person and those issues. Because for me, there cannot be objectivity in this. The other bit is like, I'm quite deliberate in terms of moving away from the traditional models that we have employed. There is too much suffering. There is too much wrong going on. There is too much injustice. There are too many problems that we cannot keep on sedating the young people. We cannot keep on feeling good about ourselves when we go at night and say we have worked with a young person. And that's beautiful. That has to be acknowledged. That has to be applauded. But fundamentally, we must begin to reimagine. We must begin to unlearn, and we must begin to engage in pedagogies of disruption. Thank you very much.